Welcome to this evening's webinar. I'm Jeff Sickinga, Executive Director of the Ashbrook Center. I want to thank you for joining us this evening for the second webinar in our series of three on moments of constitutional crisis. This webinar is co-sponsored by the Ashbrook Center and the Center for Civic Education, and we thank them for their partnership and their support of this series. This series is really part of a larger mission at Ashbrook, which is to educate our fellow Americans in the history and principles of our country and in the habits of reflection and choice that we think are essential to perpetuate our republic. So we really believe in the idea that you can learn from history and that it helps us to renew our own understanding of our principles, the principles that make us Americans, and perhaps can shed some light on issues that we face today. And we have these kind of webinars as conversations because we really believe at Ashbrook that education is not just about information and definitely not about indoctrination, but about discovering the truth. And we like to, as I always say, we like to follow Aristotle's dictum, all human beings desire to know. And then we add, but they don't want to be told. They want to discover for themselves. That's the Ashbrook way, to discover for yourself. And we've found the best way to do that is through conversation. So we're going to have a conversation this evening with two outstanding scholars and teachers of the Civil War, of the Constitution, and of statesmen like Abraham Lincoln. Joining us this evening is Dr. Lucas Morell, a good old friend of ours at Ashbrook and the head of the politics department at Washington and Lee University in Virginia. Lucas is also a professor in Ashbrook's graduate program. He teaches a number of courses there: race and equality, Lincoln, causes of the Civil War, sectionalism, a number of interesting courses across the span of really the 19th century in American history and politics, and even into the 20th. He's also a great scholar of Abraham Lincoln, has published a number of books on Lincoln, including Lincoln's Sacred Effort, which is a really wonderful study, and a new book on Lincoln and the founders. So Lucas, thank you for joining us this evening.
Glad to be here.
And our other panelist is Dr. Jason Stevens, who many of you may know. Jason is a professor in the Department of History and Political Science at Ashland University, also a faculty member in our Teaching American History seminars and in our Master of Arts in American History and Government program, where he also teaches courses on the Civil War, on Abraham Lincoln, and he happens to be Ashbrook's Director of Teacher Programs. So while he's not, when he's not administering, he's also teaching and doing his scholarly work on exactly this period. Jason, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me.
So I thought, our first in this webinar series that's being co-sponsored by Ashbrook and the Center for Civic Education was last week, and we talked about the constitutional crisis of the founding and particularly Alien and Sedition Acts, a time of great tumult, obviously, in America in the 1790s. But talk about this constitutional crisis that faces America in the Civil War. And I think I'd start with just a big question. In your opinion, what's the biggest constitutional crisis that America faces during this Civil War? Because there are many of them. What's the biggest one?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and jump in here to start. And I guess I'll just preface my remarks by saying I think I might be cheating a little bit because I'd like to give two answers to your really good question, Jeff. I think one answer has to do with the lead up to the Civil War, the 30 years or so from the 1830s thereabout up until 1860. And the question if the Constitution is a pro-slavery or an anti-slavery document, and the tension and the fraction that the fracture that creates in the American mind among the American people, where it comes to the boiling point in 1860, where now there is a serious question about whether or not we Americans, in the words of Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, are we still one people? Then my second answer would be, then there's another crisis overlapping that one that really is that comes to the surface in 1860 over secession, and whether or not there is a constitutional right to secession or not, and what that means for the nature of the Union and the Constitution. And Abraham Lincoln and many others will have a lot of interesting, serious things to say in answer to that question. But maybe I'll just begin by trying to lay out a little bit about the first answer.
Yeah, because I'm struck by that first answer. And I know it's going to elicit some questions. And for those of you who are already having questions, we welcome those. Wonderful. We'll try to get to them. Please submit those questions through the Q&A function so that we can see them and that we can get to as many as we can. But that's not what I expected you to say, Jason, that the constitutional crisis begins before the Civil War. You're not talking about the written paper Constitution. You're talking about something bigger than this. What defining America? Are we pro-slavery or anti-slavery? Is that what you mean by the constitutional crisis?
Yes, absolutely. And I think there is something else there as far as the written Constitution as well, whether or not that document and its various clauses dealing with slavery, right, whether or not does that promote, encourage, or discourage slavery. But in a larger sense, we're talking about the mind or the character of the American people themselves that begins to split in the generation after the American founding. Because in the next generation, by the 1830s thereabout, the question whether or not we are a pro-liberty or a pro-slavery people becomes significant. And I'll just try to quickly lay out what I the sort of this 30-year history. And Lucas, please feel free to jump in. You know about this a lot better than I do. But take one example, William Lloyd Garrison. Sort of the abolitionist point of view of the Constitution, starting in the 1830s thereabout. William Lloyd Garrison, who was a big fan of the Declaration of Independence, he would give these fantastic rhetorical speeches in front of crowds of people. And he was infamous for one of the first things he would do when he'd get on stage is he'd burn a copy of the Constitution. Because he understood the Constitution, he said, as a pact with the devil, right? There were certain compromises made at the origin of the American regime, compromises with slavery, and Garrison saw that as inexcusable, as a violation of the principles of the Declaration of Independence. And he said, as a result, right, no union with slaveholders, no compromise with slavery. America is a fundamentally racist nation built upon racist principles in their Constitution, and it's not worth preserving. It's not worth keeping. The Union ought to be dissolved to rid the nation of the sin of slavery. So that's one view that you get from Garrison, that the Constitution is a pro-slavery document, and that the nation itself has become a pro-slavery nation. Then you have others like Frederick Douglass, also an abolitionist, and early in his life is a Garrisonian himself, is convinced of Garrison's argument and Garrison's understanding of the American mind. But Douglass begins to drift away from that. Later in his career, Douglass becomes convinced that, in fact, no, the Constitution is an anti-slavery document. The American Union was founded in anti-slavery, pro-liberty principles, and that's something to celebrate. But the problem is we're not living up to those principles from Douglass's point of view. And the point of view of the regime, the politeia that Frederick Douglass, the greater Douglass, as he understands it, that view is shared for the most part with Abraham Lincoln, who also sees the nation founded on pro-liberty, anti-slavery principles. And it's the failure of the present generation to live up to the principles of their fathers. That's the problem. That's the crisis. And then you have others, you get to the 1850s, you have Roger B. Tawny, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who in the infamous Dred Scott decision will argue, no, the Constitution, and the Declaration of Independence are pro-slavery documents. America was founded on pro-slavery principles. And Tawny's view, though, is, right, that's the same view as Garrison, but Tawny's view is that's good, right? That's a great thing that the country is founded on these principles of white supremacy from Roger Tawny's point of view. Then you have Alexander H. Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, who will argue like Douglas and Lincoln, that the Constitution, the American regime, was founded upon anti-slavery principles. But where Frederick Douglass and Lincoln celebrate that, Alexander Stephens says that's the problem, and that's why we have to leave. That's why we have to secede, because the nation really is, right, pro-natural equality, pro-natural liberty, and we don't believe in that. We don't hold to that. We really believe all men are not created equal, that the Black man is meant to be a slave by nature, and that's why our new Constitution is founded, the new Southern Constitution is founded on the exact opposite principles of the good old one established by Tommy J and the boys. This new Constitution of the Confederacy is founded on the principles of white supremacy. And we could also get into Stephen Douglas and his view that, well, it's really the Constitution is indifferent to slavery. But I'll hold off on going there, because I feel like I'm going on for too long as it is.
Well, I mean, that's amazing. We see the one crisis is already the principles that underlying the Constitution. Are they are they anti-slavery or pro-slavery? Mm-hmm. And you're saying that at the time of the founding, there might have been some agreement on this. But by the time we get to the 1830s and beyond, the American mind, as you put it, is fracturing on that kind of fundamental question about the principles underlying the Constitution. Lucas, please jump in.
Yeah, I think Jason set the table rather well there and introduced all the relevant parties. We could say a little more about Stephen Douglas, but maybe we can catch him along the way. The one concept I would introduce, and this is really helpful, especially when you think about how we teach this period, the antebellum period prior to the war, and then the Civil War. It's very easy for us to think of our position as the righteous position if we agree with Lincoln, or if we even agree with the Southerners. That's the righteous position, and the other position, the opponents, are evil. And I would say that is not the way to understand American history, that what you actually are witnessing with these various representatives of different schools of thought about the principles of the regime and the nature of the Constitution, what you're actually seeing is not a battle of good versus evil. What you're seeing principally is a debate over justice. Aristotle teaches us that you get revolutions, you get civil wars, you get factions, not when you have good people in a city fighting against or defending themselves against bad people. What you have are two or more, but usually two groups of people fighting over a definition of justice. What is it that this regime, what is it that our Constitution, our rulers owe me as a participant in this political community? As a citizen in the South, I think I have property in enslaving fellow human beings who don't look like me, right? Justice means that the Constitution must be applied in a certain way. If I go to the federal territories, I should bring and be able and be protected in taking all of my property there in the same way someone from New England goes there. Ironically enough, someone from the South owning slaves is going to say, you can't discriminate against me because I am taking all of my property there. And you're like, no, you can't take that property. That's what the Republicans are saying. You can't take that property, and Congress can keep you from doing that. Stephen Douglas had a different opinion. The Southerners had a different opinion, the white Southerners. And so for me, what you really see there, that constitutional crisis is a crisis of justice. We became confused, or at least we had rival opinions, rival definitions of what justice meant by the time 1860 rolled around. And so you have everybody participating in the same election. And yet, for the first time in American history, the result of that election was some of the losers said, we don't want to play anymore, even though if our guy had won, everybody needs to stick around, right? But the Breckinridge, the Southern Democrats said, no, heads we win, tails you lose. That was the first time in American history where you had an election where you had to, elections by definition are going to produce political majority and political minority. It was the first time you had a political minority large enough to say, we no longer consider ourselves American. We are going to attempt to do so peacefully because we don't agree with the result. And as I put it in an Ashbrook blog back on March 4th of this year, republics can only survive if we have good winners and good losers. And secession was an instance, in my opinion, of bad losers.
Can I go back to the point you made there, Lucas, both you and Jason, because we're getting many questions now, and please, folks, keep them coming. But I want to address one of those questions, maybe a couple together here. This varying views on the principles underlying the Constitution. Is it pro-slavery? Is it anti-slavery? Or is it neutral on the question of slavery? And that's just up for a popular vote, like Stephen Douglas argued. What percentage of the American people believed in those things? I mean, I know we didn't do a public opinion polls in those days, but would we be, was it a third? Was it just sort of abolitionist radicals who had the Garrisonian view? Was Lincoln's view and Frederick Douglass's view of the Constitution as pro-liberty, was that a strange minority opinion? Was that a popular opinion? What do we have any sense of, what we get by the time we get to 1860, where is the public mind on this?
Well, I'll do this quickly, briefly. The important answer is a constitutional one. In other words, according to the Constitution, we don't govern ourselves by polls or surveys. We govern ourselves by elections. And so if we look at the electoral result, the two things to look at: what does the Constitution say? And constitutionally, of course, Lincoln won a clear majority, 180 electoral votes out of 300 and change. And so in that sense, it wasn't close. A deliberative majority of Americans believed in this fairly new party, the Republican Party, and their understanding of the Constitution as a pro-liberty constitution, one that did empower Congress to regulate slavery in the territories. Now, if you look at the popular vote, in other words, the vote of the people that produce the electors, but it's not a direct election, it's not a plebiscite. Of course, Lincoln barely got 39%. And so there wasn't a clear majority opinion of Americans who cast a ballot and said, we believe in the Republican line. There were three major parties and then a fourth, Constitutional Union Party. And what happened, of course, that produced Lincoln's election was the division of the Democratic Party. And so while John Breckinridge won an overwhelming number of electoral votes by Democrats, Stephen Douglas won, and I forget what the breakdown is, but he won a good number of popular votes, but very few electoral votes, right? 3 from New Jersey. And did he win Missouri? I forget what was the state that he won. So I look at it that way. You didn't have a clear majority that lined up with any of the major parties, but you had a clear constitutional majority.
Yeah, didn't Stephen Douglas come in second in the popular
vote? Yeah.
Last in the electoral college, right?
Yeah.
And I agree with everything Lucas just said there. I would only add that one view that seems relatively new by 1860 in comparison to the others is the Roger Tawny view. In 1857, Lincoln said of Tawny's opinion in Dred Scott, where he asserted that when the founders said all men are created equal, they did not mean to include the black man. That was Tawny's view. Lincoln responds, that's the first time anybody has ever said that out loud. Tawny was the first person, and then Lincoln will add Stephen Douglas the second, to ever argue such an interpretation of the principles of the regime in that fashion.
So that's interesting. So Lincoln's leading up to the crisis with Lincoln's election, obviously, if Lincoln's election causes secession, because we've got another question about Abraham Lincoln's views on slavery. If Lincoln's election causes secession, it must be that people think if Lincoln gets in power, he's going to try to abolish slavery, that somehow he thinks that he has the constitutional power to abolish slavery. What, in fact, was Lincoln's view on the Constitution and slavery and powers over slavery?
Jason, you want to go first on that?
Yeah, I'll start the conversation on that front. Lincoln, and I would suggest going to Lincoln's first inaugural to get the answer to that question. And in his first inaugural, he says what he said actually many other times before in various other speeches. Lincoln's view on slavery was, first of all, he says, right, personally, I've always hated slavery. He was always anti-slavery in his personal beliefs. He despised the institution. He said, if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. But then when it comes to the powers of the federal government to regulate or control slavery, Lincoln's views on that matter were something like the following. He said, look, I despise slavery, but in his first inaugural, he says, I don't even have the inclination or the authority under the Constitution to destroy slavery in the states where it currently exists. But I do have the inclination, and I believe I do have the powers under the federal government, that Congress specifically has the power under the Constitution to prohibit the spread of slavery into new territories. So Lincoln was steadfast on that point, that we're not going to touch slavery in the states where it currently exists, but we're going to prevent it from spreading to new places and growing. So like a cancer, we're going to try to keep it contained, to keep it where it presently is, but prevent it from spreading. And so on the one hand, right, this is Lincoln sort of trying to persuade the Southern secessionists in his first inaugural not to secede. In other words, you have nothing to fear from a Republican administration, right? We're not going to touch slavery where it currently exists. But he's unsuccessful in persuading them of that, because the Southerners realized that if slavery can't spread, it will eventually die out, which Lincoln admitted. Yeah, we're setting, like the founders, setting slavery on the course of ultimate extinction. And in order to preserve slavery for the future, for all time, they decide to secede.
So was Lincoln's view considered, his view of the Constitution and Congress's power to prohibit slavery in the territories in the West, was it considered a radical view, a new view? Or does it have some connection? We have another question asking, was slavery treated more as a necessary evil prior to the Civil War? Well, how does Lincoln's view of the Constitution and slavery, Lucas, connect to the American founders' view?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it's a question I took up, in fact, in my book, Lincoln and the American Founding. What I discovered after, I've been teaching Lincoln for close to 30 years now, and I'd always seen Lincoln as very devoted to the founding and almost sui generis, as if that was his thing. But it turns out what we really find in the 1850s, and especially when Lincoln decides to take on the leading Democrat, which is to say the leading politician of the 1850s, and that is without question Stephen Douglas, the incumbent senator from Illinois, Lincoln's political rival. What we find is actually a battle over interpreting the founders. Alexander Stephens is a bit of an outlier in terms of the pro-secession folks. Most seceding politicians try to link rhetorically and to some extent in principle, they try to link their efforts to George Washington, to the founding generation, right? Separating from England, right? No different than separating from America, blah, blah, blah. And Stephens is kind of an outlier in saying that, the founders believed in equality and they were wrong. That's what makes the Confederacy not just different, but better. So Lincoln was actually contesting Stephen Douglas's claim to be more faithful to what they both called our revolutionary fathers. And whereas Douglas thought that the founders were, they believed, get this, in diversity. I've already mentioned discrimination as an ironic term. Diversity is another ironic one. Douglas, that was his term for federalism. In other words, the founders, slavery, take it or leave it. It's up to you. In the North, they tried it for a while and they got rid of it. South, they tried it and they held on to it. Just leave it up to people, right? Local popular sovereignty, right? That's Douglas's view. Douglas says, I'm being faithful to the founders, right? We were almost universally slaveholders. slaveholding states, that as it were. And then, 6 of the original 13 got rid of it. And that's the American way. That's diversity. That's federalism. Lincoln says, no, 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 no. Okay. Yeah, we inherited this thing. Okay. I call it a pre-existing condition, if you will, slavery, right? It had been around for a long time before America as the United States of America existed. And so it wasn't that the founders created slavery. As Lincoln put it, we found it in our midst. And the question was, what do we do if what did they decide to do when they didn't think they could get rid of it right away? Did they indicate that they needed to get rid of it? Were they indifferent or were they beholden to it? Let's look at the Declaration and then let's look at the Constitution to see if they give us any signs. And some of the signs you guys have already mentioned. But of course, in the Constitution, it shows that at a certain point in time, Congress can, it doesn't have to, but Congress is equipped to ban one particular article of merchandise, not any other. Are they banned from regulating this particular article of merchandise? And unfortunately, that article is chattel slavery, human beings. In 1808, they are allowed under the Constitution to exercise their Article 1, Section 8 authority over interstate, but more importantly, international commerce. And that's what they do. The slaveholder Thomas Jefferson passes a law, I think it's in March of 1807, to take effect as early as constitutionally permissible. January 1, 1808, bans the importation of slaves. Why would you do that if you're pro-slavery? Why wouldn't you allow people to get slaves where they can get them the cheapest? Okay. Mm-hmm. And what else did the founders do that Lincoln reminds us of? They also prevented it from spreading into the only territory that was in possession by all Americans, which is to say the federal government, and that was the Northwest Territory. So under the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, that Congress, and then the Congress under the United States Constitution passed what we now know as the Northwest Ordinance, right? Which Article 6 of that banned slavery from that territory. Why ban slavery if they're indifferent about it, neutral on it? Or why ban it if they're in favor of it, right? Lincoln says, maybe the founders saw something inconsistent about their own pre-existing practice. Maybe they gave us this indication that this is a practice that they think needs to go away and are going to try to figure out how to do that. And that's where Lincoln says, we should take our bearings from the founding. That because they permitted slavery to continue doesn't mean that they gave it their good housekeeping seal of approval. They couldn't get rid of it right away, but they were doing what they could to prevent it from strengthening its hold over the American mind, if you will, the genius of America, and from preventing it from spreading. And so Lincoln did what he could, appealing to American history to show us that intention. And not, again, here's the thing we have to remind ourselves. We don't follow the founders simply because they were first, right? If they were bad, right? If the regime had horrible principles or if the Constitution was materially defective, we should do different, right? But the onus is on somebody like Alexander Stephens or Stephen Douglas or Garrison for that matter, on them to come up with a different interpretation than the one Lincoln is claiming is the proper one, the proper reading of the founding.
Okay, so Lincoln.
Can I jump in there just for a second? I'm sorry.
Jump in, Jason. Yep.
I wanted to just add one thing to that, because I think Lucas is exactly right. So Lincoln's view that he expresses in the first inaugural is not a new view. That's right. The federal government has no power to touch slavery in the states where it exists, but does have the power to keep it from spreading. As Lucas, explained there for us, that in Lincoln's mind, that was not a new understanding, but a very old understanding. The understanding of the founders. That I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Lucas, but I don't believe that was Frederick Douglass's view. Douglass's view was that the federal government did have the authority to abolish slavery in the states where it existed. And therefore, for Douglass, the Constitution was even more anti-slavery than Lincoln understood it.
That's a fundamental difference between Douglass and Lincoln. Good.
That's right. And the other point that you brought up about Alexander Stephens being an outlier and the secessionists doing the same thing as Lincoln did, trying to connect their views to those of their revolutionary fathers, their revolutionary founders. You see that very clearly, for example, in the Articles of Secession. of the various states. So if you go back, read the primary sources, read South Carolina's declaration of the causes of secession, read Mississippi's declaration of secession, where Mississippi says, right, our cause is thoroughly, right, wrapped up with the cause of slavery. In those various secession articles, you see exactly what Lucas was talking about. They invoke various principles from the Declaration of Independence. They love to talk about the consent of the governed, about the right to abolish abusive governments and to establish new ones. But what none of them mention is the principle of equality, the principle that all men are created equal from the Declaration of Independence. They don't try to connect themselves to that principle.
Mm-hmm. So
that is conspicuously absent from the Articles of Secession.
Right. Selective picking and choosing from the founders. But look, secession happens, right? And obviously, Lincoln's rhetorical effort in the first inaugural fails. But it's not just a rhetorical argument. I mean, we remember that last paragraph about, let's not forget the patriot graves that we share. Let's not break apart. We must not be enemies. But the argument, the constitutional crisis over secession itself, because we're getting a lot of questions, and some of them are on Lincoln's view in the first inaugural and later. Is Lincoln really looking at this as a constitutional crisis to preserve the Union? Is he looking at it as a constitutional crisis to get rid of slavery? Or somehow is it both? What's Lincoln's argument about secession and the claim that the Constitution gives states a right to secede from the Union?
Well, Jay.
Sorry, I can go ahead and try to answer that to begin with. Sure. And then Lucas, feel free to jump in. Yeah, you're right, Jeff, that if we were to view the first inaugural simply as, right, Lincoln's attempt to persuade the Southerners not to secede, it's a miserable failure in that regard, right? But in other regards, especially, right, those last closing paragraphs, especially the last one, there's much more to the first inaugural than simply that, because you see in the first inaugural, you also see in his July 4th speech of 1861, an argument for union, an argument against secession, but in particular, a certain kind of union. As he said in other speeches, like at Peoria, for instance, a union worthy of the saving. It's not just about trying to save the union, but it's about trying to save a certain type of union, one that, as he put it at Gettysburg years later, a union that is, or a nation founded upon certain principles, especially the proposition that all men are created equal. If we give up that principle, the union's not worth saving. We must save the union upon that principle. So he gives this famous speech at Independence Hall in Philadelphia on the route from his home in Springfield, Illinois to Washington, right before his inauguration, where he says, right, I've never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence. But he closes that speech and he says, right, I hope to be able to save the Union upon the basis that the founders established it, on the principle of equality to all, of liberty to all. If I can't save it upon that basis, it will be truly terrible. And I was about to say, I would rather be assassinated on the spot than surrender it.
Wow. Amazing. So Lincoln wants to preserve the Union because of his view that the Union is fundamentally pro-liberty, anti-slavery.
Exactly.
Lucas, what about his argument about why states don't have the constitutional right to secede?
Yeah, and I think this is not commented on, I think, enough about the first inaugural, and this shows you how tenuous the American Union was by the time Lincoln finally assumes office. Remember, it's a long time from November, is it 6th, when he's elected, the popular election, and then, of course, the Electoral College meets in December, and then Congress declares in January who the real winner is. Lincoln doesn't assume office until March 4th, and by that time, white citizens of 7 Deep South slaveholding states no longer believe they are members of the United States of America. They no longer are beholden They pledge no allegiance to the United States. They are not obliged to. They do not have to obey that government. It is not theirs anymore. That's the situation Lincoln faced. So it is true that this speech fails to bring them back in, but it was a fait accompli, right? The 7 states had seceded, and 4 more will secede after Lincoln calls out the militia to respond to the firing on Fort Sumter. April 12th through 14th, 15th, Lincoln calls out the militia. Virginia votes again and secedes on the 17th, and then 3 other states follow. So notice what Lincoln, this is what I'm saying, that's not much comment on. Lincoln doesn't wax eloquent on the Declaration anywhere in the first inaugural address. He knows that's going to fall on deaf ears. And so what does he do? Here's where prudence comes in. Lincoln says, what should anybody, seceding or not seceding, be willing to admit? And he says that the crisis here is a crisis of self-government, our understanding of how we resolve our political differences. So Lincoln is trusting that if they can at least once again agree that you have to be good losers and good winners for republics to work, then we can resolve this question about the future of slavery in this country. And no, I'm not going to touch it right away. He quotes his debate from 1858, his opening debate. I neither have the power nor the inclination. And then he quotes the Republican platform, which, by the way, mentions states' rights, right? The rights of states, okay? And so it's there. He's like, it's my party that doesn't believe we can touch slavery where it exists, and I don't believe I can touch it where it exists. Now, we got to go from peacetime America, March 4th, to wartime America, January 1, 1863, when Lincoln does touch slavery where it exists. That's a whole other question. But my point is, so what does Lincoln do? He makes the bread and butter of his argument this question of secession as a peaceful, political, constitutional action. Can secession be a viable, principled response to political differences? And Lincoln says no. He says plainly, right, that great line, the central idea of secession is the essence of anarchy, right? A Greek word for without rule or without order. Lincoln says, surely you agree with me that the way you resolve political differences is by talking, debating, hashing it out, and then pulling that lever or signing that slate and casting our ballots, and then allowing the Constitution to do its job. Let those gears grind away, and then that the people who are in power now won't always be in power if they're doing a really horrible job. I trust the American people will figure that out, and they'll vote us out. What happened in 1857? Again, very little commented on. Republican Party, new party, first time they run a guy for president, John Fremont, soon to become general in the Civil War. The Republicans lose. They lose by about 400,000 votes, but they almost run the table on the free states. And the Democrats notice this, especially Southern Democrats. So it's not like, all right, we defeated the Republicans, they'll go away. No, they won't. But the important thing is, what did the Republicans not do? They lost a national election, and the American way was what? To obey. It wasn't resistance. It wasn't not my president. You know when we get not my president? December 20th from South Carolina, and then 6 other states before March 4th. That's not my president. That's un-American, according to Lincoln. Lincoln believes, surely we can see that secession is anarchy, that it is not a politically viable way of dealing with political difference. Lincoln acknowledges, and this is pretty scary, in his own inauguration address, he has to talk about the right of revolution. That's nuts. But he's trying to say, look, secession isn't the right of revolution, and no secessionist, by the way, claims that it is. They are not appealing to any natural right of any human being, whether majority or minority. They are appealing to what they believe is a political right. And one thing we haven't mentioned, I hasten to add, you will get nowhere in a conversation with someone who thinks the South didn't fight about slavery. It was about states' rights. It was about the tariff. It was about Northern aggression, et cetera, et cetera. You will get nowhere. You will have an unproductive conversation if you don't talk about the nature of the Constitution. Is it really a national government, or is it a league or an alliance, or what Southern seceders like to call a compact of states? They really believed, at least they argued, I don't know if they really believed, but they argued that the Constitution was more like the Articles of Confederation. What they missed, of course, is that the Congress can actually pass laws that apply to people, individuals, not states. But the seceders wanted to argue, and did, that the US Constitution was a league, and it is a league that is acting on behalf not of people, but of states. And when some states believe other states are not fulfilling their obligation, like passing personal liberty laws that will make it harder to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act, which is constitutional, they think, wow, you are the ones breaking up the agreement, not us. And once you've done that, we have the peaceful, political, constitutional right to leave. But notice the premise, the fundamental premise, is that the Constitution isn't what Hamilton called in Federalist 15 a real government. It's more like a league or an alliance, kind of like the United Nations, right? Where it can make recommendations, but those recommendations, the individual constituent parts can agree or disagree, or in other words, obey or disobey at their own choosing. So anyway, I kind of folded in a number of things there.
Well, that's really interesting, because then it means that Lincoln, to start off the Civil War, really says, look, we have peaceful means if we have differences, we have peaceful means under our Constitution, under this national government,
Yes.
which is the government of the whole American people. With the powers reserved to the states where slavery existed, they can continue that slavery.
Absolutely.
Even though he's personally opposed to it, they can continue that. So he admits that there's a kind of federalism, there's a kind of reserved powers of the states under a national government for the whole people. Okay, now, you mentioned this already, Lucas. You mentioned January 1st, 1863.
Yeah.
That's the Emancipation Proclamation. It
Yes.
seems like when the war takes off and starts, does Lincoln's object in the war change? At first, he seems in the first inaugural to say, look, I don't have the constitutional power to touch slavery. But then in the Emancipation Proclamation, he seems to free slaves in a lot of states.
Yes.
Is that a contradiction? Did Lincoln's thinking change on the Constitution? Because that seems to be another element of the crisis, because there had been attempts by Union generals to issue Emancipation Proclamations that Lincoln said no to. How do we reconcile Lincoln's thinking on this, or was he just contradictory?
There are a number of things that change that Lincoln believes then justifies him issuing an Emancipation Proclamation as a military order. In fact, on January 2nd, it is actually issued as an order of the military. It's not simply this executive proclamation. The very next day, it's issued as a military order. The biggest shift, and this is what I have to show my students, is, well, how do you get to, I have no power nor inclination on March 4th, 1861 to January 1, 1863, freeing slaves in precisely those areas that he claimed as a Republican he did not have, and Congress did not have any authority over. And the one-word answer is war. There are things that a president can do in a time of war that he cannot do in a time of peace. That's the short answer. And one of the reasons why the Emancipation Proclamation is so boring to read and just drowning in legalese and jargon, so much so that some people thought Lincoln was a reluctant emancipator, most famously Richard Hofstadter, right? Said it had all the moral grandeur of a bill of lading. We'll leave aside the fact that Allen Guelzo says a bill of lading is actually a pretty important ththing when you're shipping stuff, right? It proves that what's on the ship is still on the ship, but whatever.
It's like as exciting as a grocery list.
Right, exactly. But the reason why that document is so, if you will, boring, and if you don't believe me, read the first 100 words of it out loud and try to not yawn by the time you get to the 100th word, and compare that to the first 100 words of the Gettysburg Address, the first sentence. It's not a speech. It is an act of the federal government by the head of the executive department, and it is an act that Lincoln knows is going to be controversial. And so he has to couch it in language that doesn't simply issue the order, but also explains the justification for it. And so he identifies himself not simply as the president, but as the commander-in-chief in a time of actual armed rebellion, right? As a military necessity. When he is done drafting this, there is no mention about how cool emancipating people is, how incredible world historic event it is. I think it's Chase in his cabinet that says, Lincoln, you realize you're emancipating slaves, you need to call attention to the fact that this is just supremely righteous. So what does Lincoln do? This is what he says. Upon this act sincerely believed to be an act of justice. Is that okay, Chase? And then he goes, warranted by the Constitution upon military necessity. I invoke the considerate judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of Almighty God. Why did Lincoln lay it on so thick on all that other stuff? Where was the Gettysburg Second Inaugural Purple Prose? It's precisely because he wanted this thing to have teeth. He wanted it to stick. He wanted it to land and be received as something that the federal government could actually do. And of course, by this time, Congress had already passed 2 confiscation acts that dealt with what came to be known as contraband, right? These slaves that had escaped from rebel-held territory. And so in that proclamation, Lincoln lays out the constitutional justification, the wartime context, and also the justice of it. But to put a bow on this, what I teach my students is what we see Lincoln doing by the time January 1 comes around, and in fact, September 22nd of 62, when he actually announces he's going to do this 100 days hence after the Battle of Antietam, what Lincoln finally decides is, you know what? I can't make abolition an end of this war or an aim, because that I don't have the power under the Constitution to do. I have to turn a humanitarian end into a constitutional means. So you take a constitutional end that is uncontroversial: preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, which is right out of his oath, written in the Constitution. He says, I take that end and then I find a means that's connected to that end. And that means is emancipation. If emancipating the enslaved people of those who are fighting against us will actually weaken them and strengthen us, because ultimately, close to 200,000 served in the Navy and the armed land forces. I can justify what I'm doing because it helps me prosecute the war. Controversial, yes. One of the dissenters in Dred Scott actually wrote an 80, 90-page screed against Lincoln. Benjamin Curtis, who Lincoln actually loved his dissent in Dred Scott. He's from Massachusetts. He said that Lincoln was acting despotically by issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. He also thought some other things Lincoln was doing was not right. But it was controversial at the time, and Lincoln did everything he could to justify it in light of his authority under the Constitution during a time of actual armed rebellion.
I see. So one of our questions was, and seemed to be touching on something you mentioned, Lucas, wasn't the Emancipation Proclamation an attempt to hurt the labor force of the South, South by drawing their labor force away?
Absolutely.
So in that respect, it's like a blockade, which Lincoln also imposed on the South. It's like shooting artillery at forces. It's another act of war. It's another means of war, of carrying on and prosecuting the war. But Jason, weren't there some Emancipation Proclamations by Union generals prior to this?
And, oh, yes. Yeah.
And didn't Lincoln actually say you can't do that?
Yes. I mean, Fremont was mentioned earlier. He does that early in the early years of the Civil War. And Lincoln, in fact, says no, right? Because Fremont had accepted these escaped slaves. He says, let's call them contraband and we'll free them. And Lincoln overturns that ruling of his generals. And his argument was, now's not the time. The condition where the war is in 1861, right, does not make emancipation absolutely necessary to winning the war. Right? It's a fit and necessary war measure warranted by the Constitution, sincerely believed to be an act of justice. It's sincerely believed to be an act of justice by Lincoln his whole life, right? But it's not a fit and necessary war measure that he can undertake with his commander-in-chief powers pursuant to the Constitution until emancipation becomes absolutely necessary for winning the war. And when Lincoln believes that, right, we've reached that point in the war, that's when he will act, but not sooner. Again, it goes back to prudence, which Lucas mentioned, he mentioned earlier. So I don't know, I know a lot of our audience here are teachers, so they probably know this story, but Lincoln meets with his cabinet, I think end of July 22nd, 1862, with the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, a draft that he had written up. And he presented it to them for their advice and opinion, not about whether or not he should issue it, but just suggestions for wording. And his Secretary of State, Seward, William Henry Seward, says, yes, we're all behind this. The cabinet's unanimous, but Seward's advice was wait for a victory, right? Because if you issue this now, right, in summer of 1862, where the Union is facing defeat after defeat, this will seem like the last gasp of a dying power, right? It will seem like, just an act of desperation. And so Lincoln is persuaded by Seward's argument. He sets the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation aside. He puts it away in his desk, and he waits for a victory that will come with the Battle of Antietam on September 17th, 1862. And then a few days after that, on September 22nd, as Lucas mentioned, that's when the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation is released. And even there, Lincoln says, right, to the so-called seceded states, right, you have until January 1st to come back into the Union, right, to give up this fight, and you can keep your slaves, right? But all of those areas that are in rebellion against the United States, by January 1st, 1863, this Emancipation Proclamation will go into effect. And the final Emancipation Proclamation is very detailed, right? There are several paragraphs talking about, right, which counties of which seceded states, right, will this emancipation affect and which ones will it not. A very detailed, a very lawyerly document, as Lucas had mentioned. And I love the story that, right, on the eve of issuing the proclamation on January 1st, 1863, so right, New Year's Eve, right, there's a big reception at the White House, and Lincoln is shaking all of these hands. He's shaking hundreds of hands of admirers because, right, everybody, right, knows the Emancipation Proclamation is about to, right, go into effect. And Lincoln had shaken so many hands, right? His hand is almost crippled by the end of the evening when he, right, ascends the stairs, right, to go up and to officially put his signature to the Emancipation Proclamation. And his hand is just like a claw. He can't even write out his own signature. And he's afraid that if he can't produce a flawless signature, that people will say, and generations later, people will look at the draft and see his, right, scrawled signature and say, he hesitated. And Lincoln's response, we're told, is, right, my whole heart is in this. If my name ever goes down in history for anything, it will be for this act. My whole heart is in this. So, right, the sheer act of will, right, with his right hand, he takes his pen, and with his left hand guides his right hand to produce a flawless signature.
Amazing. It doesn't resolve the crisis over slavery, though, right? Because we have a number of questions about the 13th Amendment. Mm-hmm. And those of you who have seen what I think is a wonderful movie, Lincoln, on the passage of the 13th Amendment, know that the constitutional crisis over slavery is not ended by the Emancipation Proclamation. And so talk a little bit, Lucas, about how Lincoln thinks we're going to finally solve the constitutional crisis of slavery that started way back in 1776, reached its peak in the 1850s, that led to secession. What's happening with the 13th Amendment and this constitutional crisis?
Right. One thing to remember, and it's kind of obvious when you point it out, but it's funny how often it's not pointed out. Emancipation is not abolition. Emancipation deals with individual enslaved people, whereas abolition deals with the actual institution. Is it legal? Is it authorized under law, under a constitution? And Lincoln
That's a really interesting distinction.
Yeah, so Lincoln understood that, look, there are 4 so-called border slave states. He always said so-called because they're not bordering anything as far as Lincoln's concerned, right? To borrow from LBJ, them's all my states, right? No state seceded, according to Lincoln. But, Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, and Maryland, right? All 4 under the federal constitution are allowed to continue the institution of slavery. And as such, as long as they remain loyal to the Union, Lincoln is obliged, if any of their slaves escape into Union camps, what does he have to do? And Benjamin Butler makes this distinction of all people, right? This Democrat, he has to return them to their owners as long as the owners are loyal. Okay. It's the slaves that escaped from Virginia. That's different. Okay. And so what has to happen is when this war is over, the question of slavery still exists because states are still allowed to decide whether they want that institution or not. Okay. So what the 13th Amendment will do for Lincoln, at least, it makes moot the question, well, what is the status of those who were emancipated during a time of war? In the same way you can seize, sorry to put it this way, but Lincoln did, seize somebody's horse or farm or estate. A government can do that. But if it's for a public purpose, right? The principle of eminent domain means what? You issue a receipt and that person gets that item or its equivalent in cash back when it's no longer needed. So what the problem for emancipation for Lincoln was, I don't know that I can actually establish their freedom forever. When there's no longer a military necessity, what is their status? And so for Lincoln, what was needed was an amendment. In those states that chose not to emancipate on their own, and of course, Maryland did, Missouri did, you needed an amendment to the Constitution. So that would mean after the war is over, once you've put down the rebellion, what about all those slave codes in Alabama and Mississippi and South Carolina? Are those still legal, right? You have put down a rebellion and you've emancipated some slaves as a result of the military necessity and the context of war, but the war's over. And so what? Are those constitutions still legitimate? Are those laws still good at the state level? The 13th Amendment, Lincoln called it a king's cure for all the evils. It wraps the thing up, right? And so for Lincoln, that was necessary. The Senate had passed by 2/3 majority, as the Constitution requires, in 1864. What the article, they're called articles, but the 13th Amendment. And we were waiting for the House to finally, on January 30th, and this is what the movie Lincoln, when Daniel Day-Lewis frees the slaves, we're waiting for the House to finally get that 2/3 majority to pass the amendment. And now it has to go to the states for ratification. And that ultimately happens in December after Lincoln's assassination, December of 65. But it was well on its way to getting ratified. And that would require 3/4 of the states, not just 2/3. So for Lincoln, you had to get rid of the institution. He says he called it the great behemoth of danger. This is the only thing, according to Lincoln, the only thing that has ever threatened the perpetuity of the United States. So for him, emancipation was not enough. It was necessary, but not sufficient. We had to get rid of the institution. And as Alan Guelzo does brilliantly in his book, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, he shows that Lincoln's plan A was not an amendment to the Constitution. It was to get states themselves to ban slavery. That way, there's no constitutional question. There's no Supreme Court case. Nobody could say that, this is controversial, you can't do it. It was impervious to challenge. And when he offered it to Delaware, that, look, we will loan you the money. The federal government will loan you the money if you do this on your own and do it gradually. We're not saying you have to free them right away, but you show this in the face of the South and they'll know that you will never come to them. Delaware had less than 2,000 slaves, and they said, don't bother asking, Lincoln. No. He does it again to all of the loyal border slave states in March, and then finally in July, when he already has a draft of the Emancipation Proclamation written, he says, look, you realize that you guys, there is no greater good that can be done by anyone in this war than you guys could do if you persuade your states to abolish, even gradually, slavery, and none of them took him up on it. So Lincoln was exhausting the most constitutionally ironclad ways of securing emancipation, which is by abolishing the institution. And when all of those failed, and the military victory, as it was, Antietam, after all, came along, then Lincoln finally resorted to a military proclamation.
So really, Lincoln tried to do this gradual emancipation early in the war. He tried to do as much justice. What I hear you both saying is that he tried to do as much justice to slaves as the Constitution permitted. And when he realized the Constitution, or knew the Constitution wouldn't permit full and universal justice to slaves by abolition, then he said, we have to have an amendment that will do that.
Right.
So we will continue to do justice and promote freedom through the Constitution, but we'll change the Constitution.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fascinating conversation. Thank you both, gentlemen, very much. I mean, I can't believe it, but our time is already up. When we get talking about Lincoln and we get talking about the Civil War, it flies by. Thank you both very much, Jason. Thank you, Lucas, for taking the time to be with us this evening. And thank you all. I know there are many questions out there that we didn't have a chance to get to. I'm sorry for that, but I'm sure if you want to send those to Professor Morell or Professor Stevens, or send them to me and I'll pass them on to them, but I know they'd be happy to take those questions. Sure. And because so many interesting topics and important constitutional issues were raised by the Civil War, and we just focused on just a few of them. But I do thank you again, all of you, for joining us from around the country. We appreciate teachers joining us with our partner, the Center for Civic Education. Appreciate teachers joining us through Teaching American History. Want to thank the Center for co-sponsoring this with us, and look forward to our next webinar. We're going to continue this series on moments of constitutional crisis. Our next webinar is entitled "A Switch in Time Saves Nine: Franklin Roosevelt, the Supreme Court, and the Constitutional Crisis of the New Deal." So we hope you'll join us for that as well. A link to a recording of this webinar will be sent to all of you. And please, we encourage you to share this with your fellow teachers, share it with your friends, your family, your children, grandchildren. Please share it far and wide. We hope that it will help illuminate this really, really pivotal moment in American history. And if you'd like more information on Ashbrook or the Center for Civic Education, check out our websites, ashbrook.org, or if you're a teacher, teachingamericanhistory.org or TAH.org, and the Center for Civic Education website, civiced.org. All three great sites, lots of great information on our organizations and programs and resources available to you. It was great to have you for this conversation. We really do believe that through these kind of conversations that we can renew our own understanding of America and its principles. I think you heard a lot about that tonight, and gain a little bit of insight for ourselves for today from our history. And I firmly believe that if we gain that understanding and insight of America's history and principles, even in a very, very challenging time for America like the Civil War, there's still hope. And when you look at those moments, you can see that hope, and in the words and deeds of a statesman like Abraham Lincoln. So with that hope, I always end and wish you the best, and ask you, please stay healthy, stay hopeful, and stay connected with Ashbrook. Thanks for joining us.